So, one thing that is very important to recognize is that understanding the disease concept for yourself is only part of the job. The other part is being able to explain it clearly to other people. Counselors are constantly translating that information. So, we're translating clinical concepts for clients, for families, for probation officers, attorneys, referral sources, and sometimes even other professionals. And if you cannot explain addiction in a way that makes sense for people outside of the counseling field, then your knowledge is going to stay trapped in your head instead of becoming useful in practice. And a lot of our clients come into treatment carrying shame and confusion and defensiveness or fear. And maybe they were called weak or selfish or irresponsible or manipulative for years. And families may still believe that the person could stop at any time if they really wanted to. And the courts and the supervision systems may focus heavily on behavior without understanding the underlying condition that's driving it. And so that means that the counselor is often going to become that bridge between the clinical world and the real world. You're not only treating the symptoms, you're educating people. And when you can explain addiction clearly, you're reducing stigma. We're increasing that buy-in and we're improving our treatment engagement. And people are much more willing to participate in treatment when they understand what they're dealing with. This is one of those skills that it kind of sounds simple, but it actually takes thought and practice. Being clinically knowledgeable is one thing, but being able to explain it in plain language is something altogether different. So, a common mistake that counselors make is explaining addiction in a way that's technically correct, but not relatable. And when that happens, the client may hear words, but they don't really absorb the meaning. So if you start throwing around terms like neurotransmission or maladaptive reinforcement or impaired executive functioning without making it understandable, you're going to lose people really quickly. That doesn't mean that you should water it down a lot. It just means that you need to translate it. So, for example, instead of saying something like, your reward circuitry has been dysregulated, you might say, over time, your brain started treating the substance like something necessary for survival, and that makes your cravings and relapse stronger. Still accurate, but a lot easier to understand. And so you want to focus on patterns and functioning. A lot of people get hung up on the question of whether addiction is a choice. And sometimes that debate is going to cause them to miss that bigger point. And the bigger point is that the substance use has become persistent, it's become harmful, and really difficult to control, even though there have been consequences. And that is what we're looking at clinically. Another important piece is tone. You want to sound respectful and calm and grounded, but if you're sounding judgmental, the client's going to shut down. If you're sounding too detached, the client may feel like you don't understand them. So the best communication usually sounds informed but human. It's going to sound like, someone who knows what they're talking about, but also genuinely wants to help. So there's several misunderstandings that come up over and over again when talking about addiction. And counselors need to be prepared for those. And one common question is, if addiction is a disease, then why did the person start using in the first place? And that question usually comes from a mindset of like black and white thinking. And the answer is that the person may initially choose to use the substance, but repeated use is going to create changes in the brain and changes in the behavior that go far beyond that first decision. I usually like to give examples here and to help people understand. I'll say, diabetes type 2 is also a lifestyle disease. That person chose to eat unhealthy foods and drinks and they chose not to exercise, and so they developed the disease of diabetes, and so now they have to manage it. And it's the same thing with addiction. Yes, they chose to do it, but now that they have it, they can't get rid of it. Another common statement is if they really loved their family, they would stop. And it sounds very emotional, but it misunderstands the nature of the compulsive use. A lot of people with substance use disorders, they do love their family really deeply. And the problem is not a lack of love. The problem is a condition that interferes with their control and their judgment and their functioning. Then there's the belief that relapse means that treatment failed. That's another one we're going to hear a lot. In reality, relapse is just part of the course of the chronic disorder, and it often signals that the treatment plan needs to be adjusted rather than just abandoning the client. A lot of times what I'll explain to clients is that, every time that someone relapses, they failed to use their coping skills, or maybe they didn't have coping skills that they needed for that particular situation. So we look at it as a learning opportunity instead of a failure. I can learn from this situation what coping skills I might need, or which ones that I didn't use and why I didn't use them, and how can I put something in place so this doesn't happen again when I have that particular trigger. It's a learning experience. It's not a failure. And we also hear people say that addiction is just bad decision making. And, of course, our decisions matter, but addiction's not fully explained by poor choices. Our accountability does matter, but it's not about our poor choices. If it was about poor choices, education and consequences alone would solve it and we'd all be out of a job. We know that's not what happens. So as counselors, we need to be able to respond to those misunderstandings without becoming defensive or dismissive. The goal here is to educate, not to argue. So this is a very practical exercise, and I strongly encourage you not to skip it. I want you to write a very short explanation of addiction in your own words. Keep it to about 3 to 5 sentences. And first, I want you to write it as if you were explaining addiction to a client who feels ashamed and discouraged. Then I want you to write it as if you're explaining it to a family member who's angry and confused. Then I want you to write it as though you're explaining it to a probation officer or a court professional who wants to understand why the treatment's necessary. And I want you to notice how your wording might shift depending on who your audience is. The core message should really stay the same, but the emphasis needs to change in each description. So for the client, we might focus more on hope and reducing shame. For the family member, maybe we're focusing more on education and the distinction between enabling and understanding. For the probation officer, maybe we're focusing more on clinical patterns and the disease being chronic, or maybe the role of accountability within treatment. This assignment's helpful because it's forcing us to practice translating the disease model into real-world language. It's one thing to understand a concept internally, but it's another thing to communicate it effectively under pressure. And the more that you practice this, the more natural it's going to become. And in your real work, the skill is going to make you more effective as a clinician. So this lesson matters because the ability to explain addiction clearly is directly connected to better clinical outcomes. When clients understand what they're dealing with, they're often becoming less defensive and more open. And when families understand addiction better, they might shift away from pure anger to more informed support and healthier boundaries. And when referral sources understand the disease model, they may be more likely to see treatment as necessary rather than optional. And this is going to help us with documentation. If we can clearly explain that disease concept, we're better able to justify recommendations in a professional and organized way. So our case conceptualization becomes stronger. Our treatment planning becomes more clear. your communication with those outside systems is going to be more effective. And in many ways, this is where the knowledge is going to turn into practice. Plenty of people can memorize the phrase, addiction is a disease. But fewer people can explain it in a way that actually changes how other people see the problem. So, that's the skill we want to build. It helps us as a counselor. It helps the people that we're serving. And in that sense, this is not just a communication lesson, it's a clinical intervention.